There is definitely an art to taking care of string of pearls plants and keeping them alive, so this is my care guide on how to do that and get these luscious, huge pearls. We're going to go through all of the care requirements, but also troubleshooting, because sometimes you're doing everything right, but something is wrong. An example of a pearl that just went wrong is this plant right here. This was my friend's plant, and they kind of forgot to water it for a very long time, and it was sitting in some south-facing sun, so it did not survive. Thankfully, I've got a ton of pearls plants, so I was like, you know what, let me try to rescue it by taking some cuttings from my own. Before we do anything, I want to put out a disclaimer. There are two types of pearls. There are some that are just smaller pearls like you saw earlier, and there are some with these bigger, luscious pearls like the ones here, so it's really important to identify which ones you have before judging the plant. Propagating is probably the best way to get a string of pearls plant, and to do that, it's really simple. You just need to identify these root bumps. So these bumps right there in the plant, they're sometimes light green, but most usually they are light brown. You just want to cut right above them. That way when you put that propagation into soil or water or whatever propagating method, it has a root to start with. Just like people, you will also find roots that come in different sizes and shapes. This one right here just ended up being a lot longer, which means it will probably take less time to propagate since it's already started its root system. If you're looking to start a fully luscious plant, I recommend taking a ton of cuttings. I think maybe like 5 to 7 is the ideal amount to start a plant. However, if you are getting just one cutting, it's still doable. It just takes a ridiculously long time. With these cuttings, you also want to make sure that they are at least 2 to 3 inches long with multiple root points. This will increase its chances of survival and will also give you backup plans in case one of the cuttings doesn't root. I think watering is probably the most difficult part about this plant because although it looks like it should be watered more frequently, it's a succulent, so it needs to be watered just like a succulent or cacti. It holds a lot of water in every single one of those pearls, so for watering, I just make sure that the soil is completely dry before I consider watering it. And depending on the soil's water retention, that could be every 2 to 4 weeks. I usually tend to water every 3 or 4 weeks. A fully developed plant should not need water more frequently than that. The pearls will also start to show signs of thirst. They'll look less shiny, they'll be dull, and in worse scenarios, they'll start to shrivel up, and that's when you'll need to troubleshoot, which we'll talk about at the end of the video. I find that pearls will still push out growth even if they're not getting enough light, but they'll start to be a lot more stringy and the pearls will be spread apart. The ideal sun conditions for pearls are bright and direct sun for most of the day and then a few hours of direct sun. I'd say in total they need about 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. I do have a ton of pearls that sit under just grow lights, and for those they sit under it for about 8 hours, but they are very bright lights. And the growth tends to be a little bit slower than if they were just under normal sun. And because they're not feeling the heat of the sun, you do need to change how you're watering the plants. From my experience, fertilizing pearls is really important because without the fertilizer, it will start to grow very, very slowly and push out very tiny, very sparse pearls. That being said, for fertilizer, I feel like it's not too picky on its nutrients. I feel like everyone has their go-to fertilizer, and I usually just go with whatever I've got and just make sure to dilute it a little bit more because the fertilizer can burn the pearls. What I usually do is I would pour the fertilizer in and then water the plant or mist the top pearls. That way all of the fertilizer is washed away. I usually only fertilize once a month, especially when it's starting to push out a lot of growth, but during the winter months, I can even get away with once every 2 months since there's not as much light and need for the nutrients. I went ahead and took my cuttings earlier, then took care of my plant, but now it's time to actually propagate these cuttings. I have done a bunch of propagating experiments with string of pearls, and I have found that water propagating to just get enough roots to then plant them in soil is the fastest way to get the plant going. That being said, you can propagate them just straight into soil. It just takes a little bit longer. I've also noticed that moss kind of works, but leca and stratum just are not the way to go. They sometimes work, but most of the time don't. I pick my propagation methods based off of my schedule. If I know I'm going to be home and can actively monitor the water propagations to make sure they don't rot, then I will obviously choose the water propagating since it's the fastest. But if I'm not going to be home, I will just plant them straight into soil and just keep it moist and lightly cover them. These are all based off of my experiences. I have found water and soil to be the best, but if you find that moss or leca or something else is your go-to propagating method and gets you the best results, then definitely go with that. But the general steps for any propagating method is to kind of pick out root nodes and then remove some of those bottom pearls and then stick them into whatever medium you're in, and then just wrap whatever it is around to try to get multiple root nodes to grow. I know with water you can't really do that, so I usually remove a ton of pearls from the bottom and then stick them all into the container to make sure that there's multiple root nodes underwater. You want to keep them moist for the whole time they're propagating until you start to see roots. For lighting, I would avoid direct light. I tend to put them in indirect light or even under a grow light since there's less likelihood of them burning. These guys are water propagating, so I am going to just let them sit for 3 to 4 days and then I will check in on the roots. These are a couple days old and I want to just take a look. I know a lot of these are not going to have their roots yet, but I do want to just make sure that the ones that do have the roots or that are in the water a little too deep are addressed. That way I don't get any rot. The general rule of thumb for propagating is if the roots have roots, they're ready to be planted. However, with string of pearls, I find that as long as there's at least like an inch of root on the cutting, I will go ahead and plant it. This one right here is like a good example of too much root and almost rot. And so that's kind of what you want to avoid. So that one is definitely ready, but a lot of these were just not fully rooted yet. With water propagating, you should be changing out the water daily and checking in on those cuttings daily, but realistically, I don't have that kind of time, so I check in on it every couple of days and I am going to change out this water. I usually just check the water. If things are rotten in there, I definitely want to change it out, and if things just look fine and the water is pretty clear, I will just leave it as is. Now I'm going through these and there is definitely a lot of rot and I find this one mushy cutting in there, so I went ahead and just did a little cleaning with a towel to just get all of that out. A little rot will always lead to more rot, so it's really important to remove all of it before putting all of the cuttings in. I went ahead and washed the container and now I'm just going to put these guys back in. My goal is to make sure that the pearls don't go into the water to avoid more rot, and these guys will sit for another like 3 or 4 days and I will check in on them in a bit. Using the right soil for string of pearls is really important because if it holds too much moisture, it will rot their thin roots. It's also important to factor in your soil type. So if you personally neglect plants a lot, you might want something that holds a little more moisture. If you tend to overwater, something super well draining. Because this is a succulent, I am going to just use straight up cactus soil. I have to make sure it is sandy, it is super well draining, so it has a lot of perlite and a lot of chunk. Also for potting, I use tissues at the bottom to just prevent the soil from coming out of the drainage holes, and eventually it will disintegrate after a couple of waterings. This is my soil mix. You can see there's a lot of coconut husk, some orchid bark, and some perlite in there as well. The pearls should be planted at the same level as the rim of the pot. Planting them too deep just does not work for the plant. For propagating, I am removing those bottom pearls and then sticking the cutting in deep enough so that all of the roots are underneath, and then any new potential root nodes can also go under as well. I use the chopstick to dig a hole and then I place the roots in, cover them up, and then the key is to wrap those cuttings around on the soil to get those other root nodes in the soil as well. This will just create more anchor points, which will allow it to grow more growth points. Most of the time we understand the care, but something is going wrong and we need to troubleshoot. And the main thing I see with pearls is watering issues. If you're overwatering, those pearls will be mushy, and if you're underwatering, they will be shriveled. You can't save those mushy or shriveled pieces once the plant has decided they're gone, but if your plant is large enough, you can cut it up and propagate it to start the plant over. If it was an overwatering issue and there was mush, I would start over with new soil as well. Now, if the plant is pushing out growth, but the pearls are really small, but they're still close together, that means that it needs fertilizer. And if it's pushing out very slow growth and the pearls are very sparse, that means it needs more sun. If the pearls that are at the top that are in the base are not doing well, but the pearls in the strings are, that means either the pearls at the top are not getting enough sun, and if they are getting enough sun, that means that there's a soil or water issue. I'm going to leave the soil of this guy a little moist for about a week, and then I will treat it like a normal plant after that. That's essentially how I care for my pearls, but if I left anything out, let me know in the comments and I will respond there.